The International Monetary Fund has confirmed that its board will consider South Africa's request for emergency funding at a meeting next Monday. Now, Pretoria is entitled to as much as $4.2 billion in funding from the global financial institution that has extended a lending facility to member states facing the economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic.
I can confirm that South Africa has requested support from the IMF. Again, emergency financing, like 71 other countries all around the world have requested. They've requested this assistance to access, to help them address urgent balance of payments needs arising from this external shock that the pandemic has has given to so many countries. And again, I note that South Africa's request is one of 72 countries that we have been providing assistance for. So what I can tell you is that this request from South Africa will be considered by our board on July 27th. So that's this coming Monday. And as always, our board will make the decision on approval and on the amount. So stay tuned. You will hear more about that, more about South Africa on Monday.
Now, in light of that clip, we now turn our focus to the funding issues related to the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. Yesterday, during his national address, President Cyril Ramaphosa detailed the use of the 500 billion rand social relief and economic support package. And he also said that besides the re-prioritisation of the existing budgets and the current application to the IMF that we just saw there, some of this money will actually come from the African Development Bank and the New Development Bank. So to help us better understand the key role that these financial institutions play and especially will play at this point and the conditions attached to these, we are now joined first by the Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of the New Development Bank, Leslie Maasdorp. Thanks so much. Good to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Mr. Maasdorp, firstly, the New Development Bank has also made some contribution to South Africa's fight against the pandemic. Can you briefly outline some of the details around this for us?
Thank you. I mean, as you know, the pandemic started in China. Very soon after the pandemic, after the outbreak, the New Development Bank put in place $10 billion emergency assistance program. So we essentially earmarked $2 billion in sum for each of the 5 countries, which we intend to allocate over the course of 2020. Of that $2 billion, South Africa already approached the bank for $1 billion, which we have already approved and disbursed to the Ministry of Finance. So this is specifically earmarked to deal with the public health considerations, beefing up the public health care system, making sure the health departments, sufficient hospitals are sufficiently stocked with protective gear, with ventilators, and all the necessary equipment to fight the pandemic. The second part of this year, for the next few months, we want to look at how can we assist and complement the government to reverse the economic decline, support small and medium-sized enterprises, support the state-owned enterprises so that the economy can get back onto a growth path. So we have already allocated $1 billion, and we intend to, and we are ready to support the government further for the remaining part of this year.
So, Mr. Maasdorp, one of the criticisms of the Bretton Woods institutions is usually the conditions attached to the loans. So what are the conditions for this New Development Bank loan, and what are the repayment expectations for South Africa?
So firstly, we are a development bank owned by 5 countries. As you know, South Africa is one of the 5 founding shareholders of the bank. we have a very different structure in the way that we operate. There are no external conditions other than the repayment terms that we set for our borrowers. So we don't set other conditions other than the country must pay us back with a certain level of interest. The advantage of a development bank, by the way, is that we provide loans with much longer maturity. So, for example, in this case, our loan have a 30-year duration. So the country, if you look at a household, if you take a mortgage, right, you don't pay it off after 5 years. So you've got a period of maybe 20 years to pay back that mortgage, which lessens the sort of, and then for you to pay back the capital. So that's the first benefit of coming to a bank like the New Development Bank. That the interest rate we charge is significantly below what the government will be able to get from many other institutions. And the reason for that is that we have a very high credit worthiness, a very high credit rating, which means that we can borrow money, we can raise money much cheaper, and then on lend to South Africa at a much cheaper rate because we have a AA plus international credit rating, and South Africa in turn has a BB plus rating. So we are significant, several levels above the country's credit worthiness, so we can give cheaper money to the country, essentially.
So, Mr. Maasdorp, you say that the interest rate would be significantly lower. Are you able to tell us exactly what it is?
So the way banks, development banks, price their loans, right? We work what I would call like a cooperative. So we have a standard rate, which we charge all of us. So we already provided $1 billion loan to China, $1 billion loan to India, $1 billion loan to Brazil, and now one to South Africa. The interest rate is the same. The loan is underpinned by a government guarantee, and it gets a little bit technical, but there is a benchmark that we use in sort of financial terms, which is a rate that the banks use to lend to each other. It's called LIBOR. So 6 months LIBOR is kind of a standard benchmark, and then we add a spread on top of that. The key point is the terms of the loan is significantly below what the government would get from any other financial institution.
All right. We'll figure that one out somewhere else, I suppose. We'll try and get the answer to that from. But for the ordinary South African, the fear may be that as an ordinary taxpayer, these loans are not only being paid by ourselves, because we saw there the IMF will be speaking to the African Development Bank after your interview, South Africa getting money from all of these institutions. But obviously, there would be concern that the country may struggle to repay these loans. Does the New Development Bank have any concerns in that regard?
Right now, what South Africa is confronted with is the reality that the economy is not growing. So before COVID-19 emerged in January this year, the country was already in a technical recession. So with the economy not growing, it means that our tax revenues have significantly now declined. So the government doesn't have the money to fund its normal programs. So the country has no option right now but to borrow. We can either grow the economy, increase the size of our tax revenues, or we borrow from elsewhere. Ministry of Finance, Mr. Tito Mboweni, has taken the correct approach, which is to look at this thing in a comprehensive manner. They could have approached South Africa from day one for a $2 billion loan, for example, but they've looked at this thing through the lenses of how can we reprioritize expenditure first? In other words, look at programs that are not that essential, make significant cutbacks and where there's, for example, areas where there's significant savings in the budget. First start there. Your first option should not be to go and borrow, because the sustainability of your debt is a very, very important consideration, which is the point you just made. But as I highlighted, development finance institutions, ourselves, the African Development Bank, the World Bank, and so on, have the cheapest available finance. And therefore, it is correct for the government to approach these institutions now in this emergency situation, because the economy right now has no prospect of growing because of COVID-19. We will go through, unfortunately, a very bleak period over the next few years. The Reserve Bank estimates up to 1 million jobs could be lost. This happened in 2008, if you might recall, with huge hardship following. So these are not nice to have. We have to borrow this money to just fund the programs of government and try to get the economy in recovery mode again.
And comparatively speaking, if you look at the other BRICS members who have also received assistance in terms of this funding to help fight the pandemic, one of the concerns is that if you look at the top five, Mr. Maasdorp, in terms of the highest infection rates, 4 of the top 5 are BRICS members. South Africa, Russia, Brazil is also in that band, and India. So is the New Development Bank particularly concerned about that in terms of members may needing to come back and borrow more from the bank?
You have just drawn attention to a very problematic statistic. That league table you've just highlighted is indeed not a very pleasant sort of one to see. As you correctly pointed out, we now have the BRICS countries, with the exception of China, as the most affected by COVID-19. We are indeed concerned, as you've highlighted. Essentially, the real risk is that this period of economic contraction and decline could reverse the significant gains we have made over the last 25 years. Since democracy, the economy has at least grown. Between 1994 until early 2000s, it's about 2.5% on average. The economy then grew up to 2008, between 2002 and 2008. Roughly grew at about 5%, so we saw significant growth then. And then in the last 10 years, we've probably averaged around just over 1%. So we were already in trouble before the crisis hit. So are we concerned? Absolutely. So the focus now has to be on getting the basics right, getting the foundations of the economy ready to restart once the COVID crisis has been dealt with. And one way to do that is through infrastructure. And the President highlighted this in his remarks as well, investing in infrastructure, building new roads, building new clinics, upgrading, and very importantly, putting in place electricity supply that is reliable and consistent, because the economy can't grow if Eskom is in the state that it is in. So infrastructure is a very important ingredient to get us out of this over the next 3 years. It won't be a short-term turnaround, unfortunately.
And just a final question with regard to that. How much has the New Development Bank pledged in terms of assistance to infrastructure development projects in South Africa?
For the next few years, every year, the bank will lend to South Africa or will invest in infrastructure every year in the region of $2 to $2.5 billion. So last year we committed $2 billion, which we pledged at the Presidential Investment Summit. We will now every year for the next foreseeable future have that number. It's roughly about 32 to 32 billion rand. So in addition to what we have pledged for COVID-19, a similar amount will be available for South Africa going forward.
Well, Mr. Maasdorp, thank you so much for your time this morning. Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of the New Development Bank, Leslie Maasdorp, talking to us there about the key role that financial institutions will have to play and are playing during this pandemic.